We're incredibly grateful for your support. Before we begin today's tale, tell us, which city or country are you joining us from? We love connecting with our global audience. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. Shattered Foundations. Mason Blackwell stared at the miniature baseball glove in his hand, his fingers tracing the worn leather where his son's small hand had once fit. The hospital corridor's fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across his face. Outside the window, Pittsburgh's skyline was obscured by a thunderstorm that matched his turbulent thoughts. "Mr. Blackwell?" The doctor's voice pulled him from his trance. "I'm sorry. We did everything we could. Leukemia." The word had crashed into their lives 8 months ago when Bennett, their 10-year-old son, had come home from baseball practice with unusual bruising. What followed was a nightmare of chemotherapy, bone marrow transplants, and finally, the inevitable phone call at 3:17 a.m. that had brought Mason racing to the hospital without his wife. "Where's Valerie?" the doctor asked, looking past Mason's shoulder. Mason's jaw tightened. "She's not answering her phone." This wasn't unusual anymore. Valerie had been increasingly absent during Bennett's final months, claiming the emotional toll was too much. Mason had shouldered the burden alone, sleeping in hospital chairs while maintaining his architecture firm. "I need to see him," Mason said, his voice hollow. In the room, Bennett looked peaceful, smaller somehow against the white sheets. Mason sat beside him, placing the baseball glove next to his son's hand. He allowed himself precisely 10 minutes of sobbing before composing himself. He'd need strength for what was coming: arranging the funeral, notifying family, and locating his wife. When Mason returned home to their Victorian house in Shadyside, an affluent Pittsburgh neighborhood, Valerie's car was still missing from the driveway. He called and texted multiple times before receiving a brief response. "Can't talk now. In a meeting. Sorry about Bennett." Sorry about Bennett. As if their son's death was a minor inconvenience. Mason poured himself 3 fingers of bourbon and sat in Bennett's room, surrounded by baseball trophies and science fair medals. The photo on a nightstand showed the 3 of them at PNC Park, Bennett beaming between his parents, Mason's arm around Valerie. They looked happy, but appearances were deceiving. Mason had built his architecture firm, Blackwell Designs, from nothing, working 80-hour weeks to provide the lifestyle Valerie had grown accustomed to. He'd missed moments of Bennett's childhood, but had been making up for lost time since the diagnosis. Valerie, meanwhile, had grown distant, her event planning business taking priority even during their son's illness. When she finally returned home that evening, her eyes were puffy but dry. "Where were you?" Mason asked, his grief making way for anger. "With clients." Then I needed time to process. She wouldn't meet his eyes. "We need to discuss funeral arrangements. I've already started planning." Bennett wanted to be cremated. Remember when he told us that after his grandmother's funeral? Said he wanted his ashes scattered at PNC Park. Valerie fidgeted with her wedding ring. "I was thinking a traditional burial. My family has plots at Allegheny Cemetery." "This isn't about your family, Valerie. It's about honoring our son's wishes." "Fine." She sighed, heading upstairs. "I need to lie down." Mason noticed something then, the lingering scent of unfamiliar cologne. He followed her upstairs, watching as she checked her phone repeatedly, smiling slightly at incoming messages. His suspicions, dormant during Bennett's illness, resurfaced with vengeance. That night, while Valerie slept, Mason checked her phone. There they were, hundreds of messages between Valerie and his best friend and business partner, Dominic Reynolds. The affair had been going on for over a year, starting before Bennett's diagnosis. The messages were explicit, discussing their future together once they were free. Mason didn't confront her. Not yet. Instead, he began planning, not just a funeral, but something else entirely. Chapter 2. Hollow Prayers. Rain pounded against the windows of Blackwell Designs' downtown office as Mason met with Dominic 3 days before the funeral. Dominic had been Mason's roommate in architecture school, best man at his wedding, and godfather to Bennett. Now, he was also his wife's lover. "How are you holding up?" Dominic asked, his concerns seemingly genuine as he placed a hand on Mason's shoulder. Mason allowed the touch, suppressing his urge to break Dominic's fingers one by one. Planning keeps my mind occupied. Anything I can do, the firm can manage without you for as long as you need. Actually, yes. I'm reviewing our finances. The medical bills have depleted much of our savings. This was partly true. Bennett's experimental treatments had been expensive, though Mason had excellent insurance. I can transfer some money into the joint business account, Dominic offered. Consider it an advance on your profit share. That would help, Mason said, noting how easily Dominic had fallen into his trap. Back home, Mason continued funeral preparations while discreetly contacting his separate attorney, not the firm's lawyer he shared with Dominic. He provided documentation proving he had been the primary financial contributor to their joint business ventures and residential properties, including Dominic's vacation home, which Mason had partially funded as a business investment. The day before the funeral, Mason accompanied Valerie to the funeral home for the final arrangements. She was uncharacteristically engaged, suggesting expensive options for the service. I thought we were keeping it intimate, Mason said, watching her select the premium casket despite their plans for cremation. Bennett deserves the best. We'll have the viewing with the casket, then cremation after. Mason noticed her checking her phone throughout the meeting. Later, he accessed her messages again. Dominic, everything's booked. Told Lauren I'm visiting clients in San Francisco next week. Valerie, Mason's barely functioning. This is cruel, but I can't pretend anymore. I'll tell him after the funeral. Mason allowed a cold smile as he took screenshots of their conversations. His attorney had advised him to gather evidence before making any moves. That evening, Valerie received a package, a black designer dress for the funeral, far more stylish than appropriate for mourning a child. Mason watched as she tried it on, admiring herself in the mirror. Is that really suitable for our son's funeral? He asked. I need to look composed. Everyone will be watching. Yes, they will. The night before the funeral, Mason didn't sleep. He finalized details with the funeral director, contacted Bennett's baseball coach and school friends, and made one final visit to his attorney, Leona Winters, a shark with a perfect record who had handled his parents' estate. Everything's in place, Leona assured him. But Mason, are you sure about this? There are less drastic approaches. They've been planning their escape while my son was dying, Mason replied. There's no measure too drastic. Chapter 3, Ashes and Acid. The day of Bennett's funeral dawned with unusual sunshine, contrasting the darkness in Mason's heart. The service at the funeral home was well attended. Bennett had been popular, and the community had followed his battle with leukemia. Mason stood stoically, accepting condolences while watching Valerie work the room like one of her social events. Dominic stayed close, his support appearing appropriate to outsiders, but sickening to Mason, who noticed their brief touches and meaningful glances. Mason delivered a moving eulogy about Bennett's courage, his voice breaking only when describing their final conversation about seeing Pittsburgh win the World Series someday. Valerie dabbed at dry eyes with designer tissues while checking her watch. After the service, as guests moved toward the cemetery for the interment of Bennett's ashes in a small decorative urn, a compromise with Valerie's desire for a burial plot, Mason overheard his wife whispering to Dominic near the restrooms. Did you move the money? She asked. This morning. The accounts are ready. Lauren suspects nothing. She's too busy with her charity planning. Lauren Reynolds, Dominic's wife of 15 years, was across the room, comforting Mason's mother. She had been like an aunt to Bennett, bringing him homemade soup during chemotherapy sessions. Mason's phone vibrated with a text from Leona. All set. The graveside service was brief. Mason scattered a small portion of Bennett's ashes at the plot, keeping most for the promised distribution at PNC Park. As people dispersed toward their cars for the reception at the Blackwell home, Mason noticed Valerie and Dominic had disappeared. His phone chimed with a notification from his banking app. Transfer of $750,000 to account ending in 4387. Then came the text that sealed their fate. Sent to him accidentally, Valerie had intended it for Dominic. On the day of our son's funeral, my wife booked a luxury cruise with her sister and my best friend. Her text burned through my grief. We're celebrating freedom from you both. Bury him alone. You and little BRAT were always the disappointing one. So I blocked all their bank accounts and mortgage loans, which I'm paying monthly. They called me in shock. 103 missed calls. Mason stood frozen by his son's grave, the phone shaking in his hand. Bennett, his brave boy who had faced death with more dignity than most adults, referred to as Little Brat. The crushing weight of this final betrayal broke something fundamental in Mason. He forwarded the message to Leona with a single word: now. Within minutes, Leona executed the financial maneuvers they had prepared. Access to all joint accounts was frozen. The mortgage payments on their home, Dominic's vacation property, and the business property were halted. All were in complex ownership structures that Mason controlled. Credit lines were suspended. Most importantly, the $750,000 transfer Dominic had initiated that morning was reversed and moved to an offshore account, along with an additional $2.3 million from their business reserves. When Mason arrived at his home for the reception, Valerie and Dominic were frantically checking their phones. Their faces drained of color simultaneously. "Something wrong?" Mason asked, his voice eerily calm as he accepted a casserole from neighbor. "I can't access our accounts," Valerie hissed. "What did you do?" "We'll discuss it after our guests leave," Mason replied. "We wouldn't want to make a scene at our son's funeral reception, would we?" For the next 3 hours, Mason played the grieving father perfectly while Valerie and Dominic struggled to maintain composure. Their phones buzzed constantly with banking alerts and increasingly frantic messages from Dominic's wife about their frozen assets. As the last guest departed, Mason closed the door and turned to face the betrayers in his living room. "I received an interesting text today," he said, holding up his phone. "Want to explain why you're celebrating your freedom with a luxury cruise while we're burying our son?" Valerie blanched. "That wasn't meant for you, clearly. But it raises an important question. How long have you been planning to leave with my best friend?" "Mason," Dominic stepped forward, "we never meant to hurt you. These things just happen. During my son's cancer treatment, that just happened to be convenient timing." "You were never there," Valerie shouted. "Always working or at the hospital. We needed each other. While I was holding our dying son's hand." Mason's voice remained dangerously quiet. "Interesting timing to reverse most of our liquid assets and property ownership into my name, isn't it? Almost like I've been planning too." Their expressions confirmed what Mason already knew. They had been too preoccupied with their affair and escape plans to notice the financial restructuring he'd been implementing for months. "You can't do this," Dominic said, panic rising in his voice. "The firm is 70% mine as of this morning," Mason finished. "You'll be receiving formal notice of your termination tomorrow. The vacation house you've been using for your rendezvous, the mortgage payment didn't process today." "Strange." "Mason, be reasonable," Valerie pleaded, suddenly conciliatory. "We can discuss this like adults. Like the adults who called our son a disappointing brat on the day of his funeral." Mason retrieved Bennett's baseball glove from his pocket. "Get out of my house. Your things will be on the lawn tomorrow." As they stood stunned, Mason added, "The cruise you booked? Canceled. The credit cards you're reaching for? Declined. The life you planned while my son was dying? Over." Their phones began ringing simultaneously. Valerie's sister, Dominic's wife, their banks, credit card companies. "Goodbye," Mason said, walking upstairs with Bennett's baseball glove, leaving them to the wreckage of their plans. "You have 30 minutes before I call the police to remove trespassers." Through the bedroom window, Mason watched them leave separately, arguing in the driveway. He held the small urn containing the remainder of Bennett's ashes. "We're not done yet, buddy," he whispered. "Not even close." Chapter 4. Scorched Foundations. 2 weeks after the funeral, Mason sat in Leona Winter's office overlooking Pittsburgh's Golden Triangle. Rain streaked the windows, obscuring the confluence of the three rivers. "They're suing for what they claim is their fair share," Leona said, sliding documents across her desk. "Dominic for his portion of the firm, Valerie for half of all marital assets." Mason examined the paperwork without emotion. As expected, they've hired Tomas Bryant. He's aggressive but predictable. And overwhelmed, Mason added. My private investigator confirmed Bryant's taken on a high-profile corporate case. He won't give this his full attention. In the days following the funeral, Mason had moved with calculated precision. He'd changed the locks, secured all important documents, and hired Preston Walsh, a former FBI forensic accountant turned private investigator. Preston had been monitoring Valerie and Dominic's desperate attempts to salvage their finances. They're staying at the Fairmont, Preston had reported, burning through what little cash they had access to. Dominic's wife locked him out and hired her own attorney. Valerie's sister Naomi backed out of their plans when the money disappeared. Now, Mason reviewed his counter-strategy with Leona. We'll offer a settlement, he decided. Insulting, but not entirely unreasonable. When they reject it, we'll drag discovery out for months. They'll be destitute before the first hearing, Leona noted, almost admiring Mason's foresight. That's the idea. Mason left the meeting with a detour to the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, where he met with Yvonne Decker, an investigative reporter who had covered Bennett's fundraisers during his treatment. I appreciate you meeting me, Mason said after they'd settled in a quiet corner of the newspaper's cafe. Bennett was special. The community rallied around him. Yvonne's expression softened. How are you holding up? Processing. Mason placed a flash drive on the table. I have information about misappropriation of funds from those fundraisers. Yvonne's journalistic instincts visibly sparked. What kind of misappropriation? The kind where my wife and business partner diverted $50,000 meant for childhood cancer research into a personal account. This wasn't entirely accurate. Mason had found they'd used the business account for personal expenses during that period, making it appear as though donation money had been mishandled. That's a serious allegation, Mason, with documentation to support it. He gestured to the drive. I found this while reviewing finances after Bennett's passing. I'm not looking for revenge, Yvonne. I just want accountability for the families who donated believing they were helping kids like Bennett. It was masterfully done, presenting himself as the grieving father seeking justice rather than vengeance. The story would run within the week, focusing on financial improprieties rather than the affair, making it impossible for Dominic or Valerie to garner public sympathy. That evening, Mason visited Lauren Reynolds, Dominic's wife, bringing a casserole and files from his investigation. Lauren, a pediatric nurse who had helped care for Bennett, welcomed him with a hug. This whole thing is surreal, she said, leading him to her kitchen. 15 years of marriage, and suddenly I discover my husband's been planning to abandon me for my son's godfather's wife. They deserve each other, Mason replied, placing the dish on her counter. But you deserve to know everything. He handed her the folder. Dominic transferred joint assets before the funeral. I've recovered most of them, and some rightfully belong to you. Lauren's eyes widened as she reviewed the documents. I didn't even know about these accounts. He kept you in the dark while funding their escape. The beach house in North Carolina? You put a second mortgage on it without your knowledge. Lauren's hands trembled. I delivered meals to you and Bennett during chemo while they were planning exotic getaways. We were both betrayed, Lauren, but we don't have to face this alone. They spent hours strategizing, forming an alliance that would prove devastating to their spouses. Lauren, hurt and angry, proved a formidable ally. I want him to suffer, Mason, she said as he was leaving. Not just financially. He will, Mason promised. We're just getting started. Meanwhile, Dominic and Valerie were discovering just how thoroughly Mason had dismantled their lives. Their credit cards were declined at restaurants. Their cell phone services were suspended. The luxury car Dominic had purchased for Valerie, using company funds Mason had traced, was repossessed from the hotel parking lot. When the Post-Gazette article ran with the headline, Cancer Fundraiser Funds Misappropriated, featuring photos of Valerie and Dominic from Bennett's charity events, their remaining social connections evaporated. The story skillfully implied their affair had been conducted using resources meant for sick children. Mason watched from afar as their world collapsed, piece by carefully removed piece. Chapter 5. The Architect's Blueprint. 1 month after the funeral, Mason stood in Bennett's baseball coach's office at Carnegie Middle School. Coach Terrence Porter had been Bennett's mentor and confidant during his illness. I'm establishing a scholarship in Bennett's name, Mason explained. For kids who show the same determination he did, regardless of athletic ability. That's wonderful, Mason. Terrence's eyes were sincere. Bennett would be proud. There's more. I'm donating to upgrade the baseball field, with one condition: it can't be announced until the construction begins. This was another calculated move. Mason was systematically rebuilding his public image while ensuring Valerie and Dominic couldn't capitalize on any goodwill associated with Bennett's memory. After finalizing details with the school, Mason drove to the offices of Rivera Development, where he met with Sofia Rivera, his biggest competitor and occasional collaborator. Your proposal is interesting, Sofia said, reviewing the documents. Merging our firms would create the largest architectural practice in Western Pennsylvania. But why now, Mason? You're still grieving. I'm refocusing my energy, Mason replied. Dominic's departure created an opportunity to restructure. Departure? The industry gossip says you forced him out and tanked his reputation. Mason's expression revealed nothing. Business disagreements happen. Along with discovering your wife and partner were having an affair. Sofia was direct. I don't judge. My ex-husband taught me the value of decisive action. But I need assurance this merger isn't just part of some revenge scheme. It's business, Sofia. Blackwell Rivera Architects would secure the convention center project. Neither of us could land individually. After 2 hours of negotiation, they reached an agreement with one special clause. Dominic Reynolds would be contractually blacklisted from employment with any of their projects or partners. That's unusually vindictive, Sofia noted, signing nonetheless. It's risk management. He's proven untrustworthy. The merger announcement would coincide with Dominic's first court appearance. Mason's timing was impeccable. That afternoon, Mason met with Preston Walsh at a small cafe far from his usual haunts. They're desperate, Preston reported, sliding photographs across the table. Hotel kicked them out yesterday. They're staying with her sister Naomi now, but that's deteriorating fast. Naomi's husband doesn't want the scandal affecting his dental practice. The photos showed Valerie and Dominic arguing in a parking lot, looking disheveled and stressed. And the offshore inquiries. They've contacted 3 different fixers trying to locate the missing funds. I've ensured they're getting misleading information. Mason nodded. Any contact with Harlan Spencer? Not yet, but they're running out of options. It's only a matter of time before they approach him. Harlan Spencer was the linchpin in Mason's elaborate plan. A wealthy developer with a reputation for underhanded deals and a long-standing grudge against Mason for reporting his code violations years earlier. Mason had anonymously fed information suggesting Harlan might assist Dominic and Valerie in their financial troubles in exchange for proprietary information about Blackwell designs. Keep monitoring, Mason instructed. When they contact Harlan, I want to know immediately. The trap was being set, layer by careful layer. That evening, Mason reviewed the legal documents Leona had prepared for the upcoming hearing. The strategy was brutal but effective. They would publicly connect the misappropriated charity funds to the affair, suggesting Bennett's treatment options had been limited by his parents' financial constraints exacerbated by Valerie and Dominic's theft. It wasn't entirely true, but the narrative would be devastating in the court of public opinion. Most importantly, it would push Valerie and Dominic toward increasingly desperate measures, exactly as Mason intended. Later, Mason visited Bennett's grave, placing a baseball alongside fresh flowers. The pieces are moving, buddy, he whispered. They thought they could just walk away after what they did to us. They're about to learn how wrong they were. As Mason departed the cemetery, his phone alerted him to a significant withdrawal from one of his decoy accounts. Funds he'd left deliberately accessible. Valerie had found one of his secondary accounts and emptied it. Mason smiled coldly. Right on schedule. Chapter 6. Calculated Combustion. 6 weeks after the funeral, Mason stood before Judge Adelaide Montgomery in the initial hearing for Valerie's divorce petition and Dominic's business dissolution suit. Your Honor, Tomas Bryan argued, my clients are entitled to equitable distribution of marital and business assets that Mr. Blackwell has vindicatively withheld. Mason watched Valerie and Dominic at the plaintiff's table. Their expensive clothes couldn't hide their stress. Valerie's makeup failed to conceal dark circles, and Dominic's hands trembled slightly. Leona Winters rose with practiced authority. Your Honor, we've submitted documentation proving systematic financial misconduct by both plaintiffs, including misappropriation of charitable funds during a minor child's medical crisis. Furthermore, Mrs. Blackwell abandoned her dying son, missing his final moments while engaged in an extramarital affair with her husband's business partner. The courtroom's atmosphere shifted perceptibly. Judge Montgomery, known for her protection of children's interests, frowned. These are serious allegations, Ms. Winters. With substantial documentation, Your Honor. We've also filed a motion to freeze the $87,000 recently withdrawn from a separate account by Mrs. Blackwell, as those funds were earmarked for pediatric cancer research. This was Mason's masterstroke. He had actually transferred that money into the account himself, creating a paper trail that made it appear as though Valerie had stolen from sick children twice. Valerie stood abruptly. That's a lie. I had no idea. Mrs. Blackwell. Judge Montgomery interrupted sharply. You'll speak through your counsel. Bryant whispered urgently to Valerie, who sat down, visibly shaken. Your Honor, Bryant recovered. These inflammatory accusations are designed to distract from Mr. Blackwell's vindictive financial maneuvering following the tragic loss of the couple's son. The timing is certainly relevant, Judge Montgomery noted. Mr. Blackwell restructured significant assets immediately before and after his son's passing. Leona was prepared. With documented evidence of the defendant's planned abandonment, Your Honor, we've submitted text messages indicating Mrs. Blackwell and Mr. Reynolds intended to abscond with marital and business assets immediately following the child's funeral. The judge reviewed the messages, her expression hardening. These are disturbing. They refer to my dying son as the little brat. Mason spoke for the first time, his voice steady but wounded. While planning a luxury cruise during his funeral, the gallery murmured in shock. Judge Montgomery struck her gavel once. I've heard enough for today. I'm issuing a temporary injunction maintaining the current asset freeze pending full financial discovery. And Mrs. Blackwell, she added severely, the funds withdrawn last week are to be returned to the court's escrow immediately. We'll reconvene in 30 days. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Bryant hustled Valerie and Dominic toward a waiting car, while Mason and Leona delivered measured statements about seeking justice for Bennett's memory. That afternoon, Preston Walsh confirmed what Mason had been waiting for. Dominic had contacted Harlan Spencer. They met at Spencer's club, Preston reported. Spencer offered them a deal, proprietary information about your projects in exchange for financial assistance. Excellent, Mason replied. Make sure our inside man at Spencer Development has access to the fake server. For months, anticipating this moment, Mason had maintained a shadow server containing misleading information about his most valuable projects. If Dominic attempted industrial espionage, he would deliver worthless or actively harmful data. Meanwhile, the Pittsburgh business community was buzzing about the merger announcement between Blackwell Designs and Rivera Development. The timing, coinciding with Dominic's courtroom humiliation, was no accident. At the merger celebration that evening, Mason played the role of resilient survivor perfectly. Sofia Rivera introduced him to potential clients as the visionary reshaping Pittsburgh skyline, while subtle whispers about Dominic's disgrace circulated among industry insiders. Later that night, Mason received a call from an unlisted number. You've made your point. Valerie's voice was strained. We're destroyed. What more do you want? Interesting question from someone who called our son a disappointing brat on the day of his funeral. It was a terrible mistake. I was emotional, not thinking clearly. Like when you withdrew money from the Cancer Research Fund. Her sharp intake of breath confirmed she'd realized the trap. You set me up. I simply created opportunities for you to reveal who you truly are, Mason replied calmly. How's the Fairmont treating you? Oh wait, you were evicted. Naomi's spare bedroom must be cozy for you and your lover. Please, Mason, we need to end this. A reasonable settlement. You'll receive precisely what you deserve, Mason interrupted. Nothing more, nothing less. Give Dominic my regards. I hear Harlan Spencer's looking forward to your next meeting. Mason ended the call, satisfied. They were proceeding exactly as predicted, desperate, reckless, and walking directly into his most elaborate trap. The following morning, Dominic met again with Harlan Spencer, this time receiving a $150,000 cash advance against promised architectural plans for Blackwell's convention center bid. What Dominic didn't know was that Spencer's assistant was on Mason's payroll, documenting every aspect of the industrial espionage. By evening, Preston had delivered photographs and recordings of the exchange to Mason, who forwarded them to Leona with instructions to prepare additional legal filings for corporate sabotage and theft of intellectual property. This is becoming personal, Mason, Leona cautioned. The courts may see this as excessive retaliation. It's not retaliation when they're actively committing crimes, Mason countered. Besides, they haven't hit rock bottom yet. What else could possibly happen to them? Leona asked, concerned. Mason's smile was chilling. The money Spencer gave them? Marked bills from a federal investigation. My contact at the FBI Economic Crimes Unit has been very interested in Spencer's activities for months. Leona stared in disbelief. You've orchestrated a federal crime. I've created circumstances where criminals might expose themselves, Mason corrected. Dominic and Valerie chose to commit industrial espionage. Spencer chose to engage in corporate bribery. I'm merely ensuring the appropriate authorities are aware. As Mason left Leona's office, his phone chimed with a text from Lauren Reynolds. It's done. Dominic's medical license application shows he prescribed medications for Bennett without proper authorization. The medical board is investigating. Another piece falling perfectly into place. Mason had discovered that during Bennett's treatment, Dominic had occasionally called in prescriptions using his architectural license number, which coincidentally matched a retired physician's DEA number. It was a minor, likely accidental transgression, but in context with the other allegations, it appeared sinister, suggesting Dominic had impersonated a doctor during Bennett's treatment. The noose was tightening, one carefully measured increment at a time. Chapter 7, Scorched Earth. 3 months after Bennett's funeral, Mason stood in the newly renovated pediatric oncology wing of Pittsburgh Children's Hospital, cutting a ribbon with oversized ceremonial scissors. The plaque beside him read, "The Bennett Blackwell Memorial Wing, where hope never surrenders." Cameras flashed as Mason presented a check for $1.2 million, drawn from the accounts he had reclaimed for Valerie and Dominic, with substantial personal additions. Bennett fought with extraordinary courage. Mason told the assembled crowd, his voice steady. This wing will ensure other children have every possible resource in their battles. The hospital's chief of oncology shook Mason's hand enthusiastically. This facility will change lives, Mr. Blackwell. Afterward, a reporter approached Mason. Any comment on the federal indictment against Dominic Reynolds and Harlan Spencer for industrial espionage and fraud? It's unfortunate, Mason replied with practiced neutrality. I'm focused on honoring my son's memory through positive contributions. The reporter persisted. Sources say your ex-wife Valerie has been named an unindicted co-conspirator. No comment. Today is about Bennett and the children who will benefit from this facility. Mason's measured response concealed his satisfaction. The federal investigation had moved with surprising speed, partly due to the evidence Mason had ensured reached the proper authorities. Dominic and Harlan Spencer had been arrested the previous week, their clumsy attempt at corporate espionage now entangled with Spencer's existing legal troubles. Valerie had narrowly avoided arrest, but remained under investigation. Their individual legal problems had fractured their relationship. Dominic had attempted to blame Valerie for initiating the scheme, while she claimed ignorance of illegality. After the hospital ceremony, Mason met with Preston Walsh at their usual cafe. Dominic's lawyer is pushing for a plea deal, Preston reported. The feds aren't interested unless he could deliver something on Spencer's other operations. And Valerie? Staying with her parents in Philadelphia. Her sister Naomi cut ties completely after the Cancer Fund scandal made national news. Valerie's event planning contacts have blacklisted her. Mason nodded, satisfied. The medical board? Dominic's architecture license is suspended pending the criminal case. The medical board issued a cease and desist regarding any involvement with prescriptions. His professional reputation is destroyed. In the civil suit, Judge Montgomery has scheduled the final hearing next week. Given the criminal charges, your attorney expects a summary judgment in your favor. Mason sipped his coffee thoughtfully. They haven't tried to contact Bennett's friend Tyler, have they? Preston shook his head. Not that we've observed. The Williams family hasn't reported any unusual contacts. This was crucial. Tyler Williams had been Bennett's best friend and knew something that could potentially complicate Mason's narrative. That Bennett had actually admired Dominic and had once expressed hope that his father and godfather would work together more closely. It was a minor detail, but could humanize Dominic in ways Mason couldn't afford. Keep monitoring the situation, Mason instructed. Any attempt to build sympathy through Bennett's friends needs to be intercepted. Later that day, Mason visited the construction site of what would become Pittsburgh's most distinctive new skyscraper. The joint project of Blackwell Rivera Architects that had once been Dominic's dream commission. The irony was profound. Dominic had sacrificed everything for a relationship with Valerie, including the career pinnacle that now belonged to Mason. As Mason inspected the foundation work, his phone rang, Valerie's number. "Hello, Valerie," he answered calmly. "They're saying I could be indicted." Her voice was trembling. "Mason, you have to help me. I didn't know what Dominic was doing with those plans. That's between you and the federal prosecutors. You know, I didn't steal from Bennett's cancer fund. You set me up, like you were setting me up while our son was dying, planning your escape with my best friend. It wasn't like that. We just fell in love." Mason's voice hardened. "Save it for someone who hasn't read your texts about celebrating freedom from me and the little brat on the day of his funeral." I was emotional, not thinking clearly. Bennett's illness was destroying me too. Interesting. I don't recall you spending nights in hospital chairs or researching experimental treatments. That was me, while you were planning vacations with Dominic. Please, she begged. My parents are mortgaged to the limit for my legal fees. I have nothing left. What do you want from me? I want you to experience precisely what you deserve, Mason replied. Nothing more, nothing less. This vendetta won't bring Bennett back. Mason's voice became dangerously quiet. No, it won't. But it ensures that every time someone searches your name or Dominic for the rest of your lives, they'll know exactly what you did. That's a fitting memorial for the son you abandoned. He ended the call, pocketing his phone as Sophia Rivera approached. Everything okay? She asked, noting his expression. Family matters, Mason replied. The foundation looks solid. Like everything you build, Sophia observed. The bank approved the additional financing for the East Wing expansion. We can add the community art space you wanted. Mason nodded, refocusing on the project that would define Pittsburgh's skyline for generations, a legacy that should have included Bennett someday. That evening, Mason received another call, this time from Dominic's lawyer, proposing a settlement. Dominic would relinquish all claims to the business in exchange for Mason's testimony that Dominic had been manipulated by Spencer. Mason declined without hesitation. He made his choices. Now he lives with the consequences. The next day, Tyler Williams and his parents arrived at Mason's home for dinner, a monthly tradition Mason had maintained since Bennett's passing. The baseball field looks amazing, Tyler said, showing Mason photos on his phone. Coach says the Bennett Blackwell Memorial Diamond will be ready for spring season. Mason smiled genuinely for the first time in days. Bennett would have loved that. After dinner, Tyler's father David pulled Mason aside. Someone contacted Tyler through his gaming account, asked questions about Bennett and Dominic's relationship. Mason's expression darkened. What kind of questions? About whether Bennett talked about Dominic. Tyler blocked them, but thought you should know. Thank you, Mason replied, his mind already calculating this new development. Tyler shouldn't respond if they try again. After the Williams family departed, Mason contacted Preston immediately. They're getting desperate, Preston confirmed after hearing about the contact. Looking for character witnesses, anything to mitigate the damage. Increase surveillance, Mason instructed. Any approach to Bennett's friends needs to be documented and countered. The final pieces of Mason's retribution were falling into place. The next week would bring the civil judgment, likely followed by federal indictments. Dominic and Valerie would be left with nothing. No money, no reputations, no future in Pittsburgh or beyond. Just as they had left Mason with nothing but grief and betrayal on the day, they should have been united in mourning their son. Chapter 8. Immolation. The courtroom was packed for the final hearing in Mason's civil case against Valerie and Dominic. Judge Adelaide Montgomery reviewed the voluminous documentation before addressing the attorneys. Given the federal indictment against Mr. Reynolds and the ongoing investigation involving Mrs. Blackwell, I see little reason to delay judgment in this matter. Tomas Bryant made a last desperate attempt. Your Honor, we request postponement pending resolution of the criminal matters. My clients cannot fully defend themselves in this proceeding without potentially compromising their Fifth Amendment rights. Judge Montgomery was unmoved. They should have considered that before misappropriating funds and engaging in industrial espionage, Mr. Bryant. This court will not reward such behavior with indefinite delays. The judgment was devastating. Full dissolution of the marriage with all contested assets awarded to Mason. Complete severance of Dominic's connection to the architectural firm with no compensation. And most damaging, a finding that both Valerie and Dominic had demonstrated unconscionable conduct during a minor child's terminal illness, resulting in additional punitive damages. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed around Mason and Leona. This judgment validates what we've maintained throughout. Leona stated professionally. Mr. Blackwell was the victim of profound personal and professional betrayal during an unimaginable family tragedy. Mason added a single, measured comment. Today isn't about victory. It's about accountability. I hope this brings some sense of closure to everyone who supported Bennett during his courageous battle. The calculated statement ensured the news coverage would again connect the legal proceedings to Bennett's memory, reinforcing public perception of Valerie and Dominic as villains who had betrayed a dying child. Later that afternoon, Mason met with Lauren Reynolds at a quiet restaurant overlooking the Monongahela River. Their alliance had evolved into friendship, united by shared betrayal and coordinated response. It's finally over, Lauren said, raising her glass in a toast. 15 years of marriage, erased by his greed and selfishness. Not quite over, Mason corrected. The federal case is just beginning. Dominic's lawyer called again. He's desperate for character witnesses. Everyone's abandoned him. Mason nodded. Valerie's experiencing the same isolation. Her sister Naomi filed a restraining order after Valerie showed up at her dental practice demanding money. Lauren studied Mason carefully. Are you satisfied now? They're destroyed, financially, professionally, socially. Almost, Mason admitted. There's one final piece. The Convention Center project? The grand opening coincides with what would have been Bennett's 11th birthday. Dominic's sentencing hearing is scheduled for the same day. Lauren shook her head in amazement. Your timing is surgical. I prefer the term architectural, Mason replied with a rare smile. Every element precisely placed for maximum effect. That evening, returning home, Mason found Valerie waiting on his doorstep, looking haggard and desperate. Breaking and entering now? He asked coldly. I didn't break in. I'm just sitting here. She rose unsteadily. We need to talk, Mason. The courts have said everything necessary. Dominic's facing prison. The feds are still investigating me. My parents have mortgaged their retirement to pay my legal fees. Isn't that enough? Mason unlocked his door. Would you like to come in for this conversation? The neighbors have endured enough spectacle. Inside, Valerie looked around the home she had once shared, noting the changes. Bennett's baseball trophies now occupied prominent positions in the living room. Her decorative touches had been systematically erased. You've been busy, she observed. Redefining, Mason corrected. Like you were planning to do after our son's funeral. Valerie sank onto the couch. I was going to tell you properly. After we'd had time to grieve, while absconding with half our assets. I never meant, she began, then stopped herself. That text was inexcusable. I was emotional, saying things I didn't mean. You meant every word, Mason replied evenly. You just never intended me to see it. I loved Bennett. When it was convenient. When it didn't interfere with your affair or social calendar. Valerie's facade cracked. What do you want, Mason? Total destruction? You've taken everything. Our home, my reputation, my career. I'm facing potential federal charges. My own sister won't speak to me. Is this bringing Bennett back? Is this honoring his memory? This isn't about Bennett, Mason admitted, his voice suddenly tired. It's about consequences. You and Dominic made calculated decisions for months, prioritizing your pleasure over our son's needs during the worst crisis imaginable. So this is justice. This is natural law. Every action creates an equal and opposite reaction. Your actions destroyed our family during Bennett's final months. My reactions ensure you experience equivalent loss. Valerie stared at him. You've become something terrible, Mason. I've become what you and Dominic created, he corrected. Now, unless you have a legitimate purpose for this visit, I'll have to ask you to leave. I need money, she admitted finally. Just enough to start over somewhere else. Mason laughed without humor. That's why you came? For a handout? For mercy, she whispered. Something you've forgotten exists. Interesting perspective from someone who called our dying son a disappointing brat. Mason opened the front door. Goodbye, Valerie. After she left, Mason poured himself bourbon and sat in Bennett's room, now preserved as a memorial. The baseball glove remained on the nightstand beside photos of happier times. Almost done, buddy, he whispered to the empty room. Almost done. The following day brought news that Harlan Spencer had accepted a plea deal, implicating Dominic in multiple instances of corporate espionage beyond the Blackwell Designs case. Dominic's lawyer immediately filed motions claiming his client had been manipulated, but the prosecutor's office released text messages showing Dominic had initiated the criminal conspiracy. Mason watched the news coverage with satisfaction. The final dominoes were falling exactly as he had arranged them. Preston Walsh arrived that evening with his final report. Federal prosecutors are offering Valerie a deal, testimony against Dominic in exchange for probation. Will she take it? Her attorney is pushing for it. They've scheduled a meeting tomorrow. Mason nodded. And the property in their names? All in default. Foreclosures are proceeding. Dominic's vacation home sells at auction next month. Perfect timing for the convention center opening and Bennett's memorial scholarship announcement. Preston hesitated. There's one more thing. Dominic attempted suicide in custody last night. He's under observation at the hospital. This was unexpected. Mason absorbed the information silently before asking, serious attempt? Apparently. He left a note apologizing to Bennett. Mason swirled his bourbon thoughtfully. Monitor the situation. This changes nothing. But after Preston left, Mason sat alone in Bennett's room longer than usual, the weight of his orchestrated destruction suddenly tangible. Dominic had been his friend for 20 years before the betrayal, best man at his wedding, godfather to his son. Now he was a suicidal prisoner awaiting sentencing, his entire existence dismantled according to Mason's precise specifications. For a brief moment, Mason questioned whether he had gone too far. Then he remembered the text message, the little brat, and his resolve hardened once more. The reckoning wasn't complete yet. Chapter 9, From the Ashes. 1 year after Bennett's funeral, Mason stood at the podium in the grand lobby of the newly completed Blackwell Rivera Tower, addressing Pittsburgh's business and civic leaders. Today would have been Bennett's 11th birthday. He began, his voice strong and clear. In his honor, we're establishing the Bennett Blackwell Foundation with an initial endowment of $10 million dedicated to pediatric cancer research and support for families facing similar battles. Applause echoed through the spectacular atrium, a soaring space Mason had redesigned to include a constellation of lights representing the exact star pattern visible on the night of Bennett's birth. The Foundation's first initiative will be fully funded home health care for pediatric cancer patients, ensuring no child faces treatment alone and no parent must choose between employment and caring for their child. This pointed reference to Valerie's absence during Bennett's final days wasn't lost on those familiar with the scandal. The Foundation's structure, specifically prohibiting anyone convicted of financial crimes from involvement, similarly ensured Dominic could never benefit from its resources or prestige. After the ceremony, Sofia Rivera joined Mason at the reception. Masterful as always, she observed. The foundation is a fitting tribute. It's what Bennett deserved all along, Mason replied. Have you heard the news about your ex-wife? Mason nodded. Philadelphia. Small event planning business under her maiden name. Starting over. And Reynolds. 3 years in federal prison, following today's sentencing. No possibility of reinstating his architectural license afterward. Sofia studied him carefully. Are you finally satisfied, Mason? Has enough blood been spilled? It was never about satisfaction, Mason corrected. It was about balance. They've experienced precisely what their actions merited. No more, no less. Later that evening, Mason visited Bennett's memorial at PNC Park, a small plaque on the wall near their regular seats, placed there by the Pirates organization in recognition of Bennett's devotion to the team. As he touched the cool metal, Mason sensed someone approaching. I thought I might find you here, Lauren Reynolds said softly. Today was Bennett's birthday. In Dominic's sentencing, Mason added. I was there, Lauren confirmed. He looked broken, as he should. Lauren sat beside Mason, watching the maintenance crew preparing the field for tomorrow's game. What comes next for you, Mason? The revenge is complete. The tower is built. The foundation is launched. Living, Mason said simply, honoring Bennett's memory through actions rather than destruction. Do you ever regret how far you went? Mason considered the question seriously. No. They made calculated choices that destroyed our family during Bennett's final months. I made calculated choices ensuring they experienced equivalent consequences. The symmetry is appropriate, and forgiveness is for those who seek it genuinely, not those who got caught. Mason stood. Bennett faced his death with more courage than they demonstrated in life. I won't dishonor his memory by pretending their actions deserve absolution. As they walked through the empty stadium, Lauren asked, will you ever tell Bennett's story? The full version? Someday, when the foundation has funded enough research to ensure other children have better outcomes than Bennett did. At the stadium exit, Lauren hesitated. Dinner next week? The new place on Carson Street. I'd like that, Mason replied, his first step toward whatever came next. Driving home, Mason passed the cemetery where a portion of Bennett's ashes remained. The main portion had been scattered at PNC Park during a private ceremony the Pirates had arranged, fulfilling Bennett's wish. Mason didn't stop. There was nothing there for him anymore, just as there was nothing left of the man he had been before betrayal and grief had transformed him. In his driveway, Mason noticed an envelope taped to his door. Inside was a baseball card, Bennett's favorite player, with a simple note, he would want you to be happy again someday. V. Mason studied the card, recognizing it as one Bennett had been searching for before his diagnosis. Valerie must have purchased it during those early hospital days. For a moment, Mason considered discarding it, one final rejection of anything connected to her. Instead, he carefully placed it in Bennett's memorial case in the living room. Smart move, buddy, he said to the empty house. Always complete the collection. Later that night, Mason received a text from Sofia Rivera. Congratulations on the foundation launch. The board unanimously approved your sabbatical. Take the time you need. Mason had decided to travel, visiting baseball stadiums across America, as he'd once promised Bennett they would. It wasn't forgiveness or healing, exactly. It was simply the next architectural phase of a life rebuilt from ashes. On his nightstand, Mason kept the urn with the remainder of Bennett's ashes and the baseball glove that had accompanied them through the long hospital vigils. Tomorrow, he would begin planning his journey. But tonight, in the quiet house, purged of betrayal shadows, Mason allowed himself to acknowledge a simple truth. The meticulous demolition of those who had betrayed them had been necessary, but it hadn't diminished his grief. That would require a different kind of construction, something only time could engineer. We did it, Bennett, he whispered to the darkness. They paid for what they did to us. Now we build something new. Outside, Pittsburgh's skyline gleamed with the lights of the tower bearing his name. A monument visible from Bennett's grave, the convention center, and the prison where Dominic would spend the next 3 years. Mason had designed it that way intentionally. An architect always considers all perspectives. even in retribution. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there.